What's up, friends? Today we are taking over the Heretics podcast and giving you a sneak peek into my new podcast called 10x Recruiting, brought to you by our friends at Metaview. The reason we built 10x Recruiting is because a great podcast for recruiters, hiring managers, interviewers, and everybody involved in hiring doesn't exist until now. So today we're going to show you our episode with Arthur Matuszewski. Arthur blew my mind in this conversation. It's one of the best conversations I've had podcasting in the last 2 years. Even if you're on the HR side, you're going to love this episode and you should totally give it a shot. After this episode, do me a favor, head over to our YouTube page and subscribe to be a 10X podcast listener. And without further ado, here is Arthur Matuszewski on the newest episode of 10X Recruiting, brought to you by Metaview. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of 10X Recruiting, brought to you by Metaview. I'm Nolan, your co-host. I got Sile, the CEO of Metaview here. Sile, we talked to Arthur Matuszewski. What was your takeaways from this episode?
First of all, takeaway was so glad we got him on the pod. Awesome thinker, like amazing journey. The thing that really resonated, and you just don't hear almost at all, I think, in other recruiting conversations, is this bias towards avoiding false negatives in hiring, more so than necessarily getting every hire right. I think, frankly, every conversation I'm in with recruiting leaders at the moment, there's a lot of talk about either efficiency or it's about quality of hire. And it was like a bit of a mind shift to think, well, no, there's a third way or a second way, which is don't worry about quality of hire. Just like make sure you expose yourselves to the potential of greatness. If you get it wrong, fire them quickly. I'm not saying it's like definitely the way to go, but I think it's definitely something to think about. If you can build that muscle, and maybe if you can even build a culture where it's really obvious to anyone applying to a company that that's the way that they operate, and you're going to get a chance. It's going to be totally fair. If you don't hit the ground running, you're going to be out. You'll get the right people applying for your company if you make it very clear that's the way. So anyway, I thought that was like an amazing thought. Don't fetishize so much getting the hire right when you have such little information. The reality is when you make an offer to someone, you're never going to have less information about that person than you do at that point. You're only going to get more information after they join you.
I'm totally with you, by the way. Like, I'd never heard anybody describe it like that. It has completely reshifted the way I'm even thinking about talent as I'm doing recruiting right now. So I love that one. Mine is the only thing that matters is the value you create. So I think we're exiting this era right now to where people are pointing to titles or companies that they worked at. Like, none of that stuff matters anymore. The only thing that matters is value creation. And I think actually it's up to everybody in the interview process to prove how you can do that. You and I talk about AI a lot. And one of my takes with AI is like, don't worry about candidates cheating. Instead, worry about like, what can you learn from this candidate to apply to your organization? And so I think we're moving towards this world to where all that matters is value creation. And you're going to have to prove that from the time that you're a candidate all the way through the time that you're an employee.
Yeah, super interesting. I do think there's a world where you could be more of a passenger in a company, still be quite high potential, have seen what amazing looked like, and now looking for your opportunity to like do it and execute. I think there is something to be said for like having been surrounded by elite performance means it might be worth taking a bet on that person in some cases. So I don't know if it'll be like super like crystal clear, like just focus on purely what they've actually done. Maybe there's some other things that will factor in as well.
Yeah, I'm aligned with you. I think the thing that Arthur and I were talking about is like these halo resumes, right? These halo companies to where it's like, I worked here, so like I've checked the box and now I'm good. That shit doesn't matter anymore.
But that's because those institutions have also faltered, right? There's like the canonical like FANG companies. We all know that they've laid off a bunch of people because we think they, at least internally, the feeling was that they had gotten fat and they had a load of people who weren't doing any work. And frankly, you hear about recruiters joining Meta or something, and like it's okay not to hire anyone for this first 6 months. I think people know that now. I think that could just as much be a reflection of the institutions, those large companies and educational institutions maybe having screwed the pooch a little bit, and they might fix that, and then we will really respect that again in future. So yeah, I don't know how much of that is actually associated with like a changing time versus just like a very temporary, well, this other thing happened over here.
Totally. Do you have any other takeaways?
I do, but the false negative was the big one. And I think just maybe one thing to just stress on that, just because the language is not like this false negative, false positive language is not something people use every day. And you didn't go super deep in it during the pod. Just to be super clear, most people when they're hiring, they try and avoid a false positive. A false positive is when you falsely give someone a yes. They didn't deserve a yes because they're not a good fit for your company. You give them a yes. What Arthur describes is he likes to avoid false negatives. He hates the idea of someone amazing being in his pipeline and him not giving them a yes. That's the thing he's trying to avoid above all else, is a scenario where someone who was good didn't get the opportunity to join the company and have this outsized impact on their company.
All right, I've been podcasting for 2 years or so now. This is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. The amount of depth here is unparalleled. So I'm excited for you guys to enjoy this conversation with Arthur Matuszewski. This is 10X Recruiting, a podcast from Metaview. Let's get after it. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of 10X. All right, Arthur. So I'm going to set this bar very high for the audience. I think you're one of the smartest people I know. I think you're definitely the smartest talent person that I know. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'll try to live up to the hype.
Yeah, don't blow it. Okay, so I want the quick arc for the audience of your career. Can you give us like the 2 to 3 minute spiel of what you've done so far?
Totally. So way back, I started a babysitting business. And so on the other side of the recession, got a bunch of bankers and consultants and their unemployed friends to babysit Upper East Side, Upper West Side families in New York. We grew a bunch, realized it's much more risky once you start putting kids in cars. And so we wound up selling the business and I wound up at Bridgewater. Not all that different than babysitting, as it turns out. But spent a lot of time figuring out what made our people successful and how do we find more of them. Initially started off on the investment side in emerging markets and commodities, and then wound up working into general management. Spent a lot of time trying to put 22-year-olds through psychometric assessments and assess how their abstract reasoning could predict future potential. Ran off from Bridgewater to Colorado, worked on a marijuana venture, great taste of startup life, but ultimately more of a science project than a startup. Came back to New York, spent a few years in private equity consulting, helping boring businesses get more creative. Wound up leaving that and joining Wayfair and helping them post IPO scale up across the board, everything from warehouse workers to data scientists, and then had a uniquely exciting hypergrowth journey with Better, which at one point was LinkedIn's #1 startup and had all the excesses of the ZERP era. Spent a little bit of time palling around with a number of VCs and operators, supporting them in their businesses, and now run Carrara, which is an operating firm helping investors and their founders at moments of unique inflection on this intersection between people, talent, and business operations.
Okay. So for the audience, if you listen to your podcast on like 1.5 or 2x speed, you will notice with Arthur, you're going to have to slow it down. Okay. So we're going to get to Carrara in a little bit, but I actually want to start with Bridgewater, and it's infamous for the way it acquires and manages top talent. What were your biggest learnings about people at Bridgewater?
Totally. Couple fold. I think ultimately you're only as good as the team. I think it was an interesting journey of Bridgewater where we spent all this time trying to identify individual exception. We brought those folks together, and at the end of the day, we still struggled to make things make sense. I think that the sum of the whole is not always greater than its parts when the work is confusing and you're not focused on what will move the needle forward. So much of Bridgewater was predicated on this notion of not fucking it up. And ultimately, I think the challenge of not fucking it up is that incrementally improving things is its own reward, but it's not what exception wants to do day in and day out. I think the second piece ultimately is mostly around the idea that when you're sort of bringing people in, there's a lot of context and there's a lot of understanding that gets lost. What made a person successful in one environment is not always what will make them successful in another. And so this idea of we'll find the best of the best and not ask for what is a challenge, I think, in every organization, but it's uniquely true when you're taking entrepreneurs and consultants and trying to plop them into a hedge fund and expecting them to know what the most important thing to do is. And then I think the third piece ultimately is that relationships come from the work. Bridgewater was famous for this idea of meaningful work and meaningful relationships. I'm fortunate to have carried that through with me throughout my career. But you, as much as you can, put people through a battery of psychometric tests and get to know them, it's not until you're getting chewed out by an LP or aggressively debated in the heat of an investment committee that you really come to understand what testing relationship means. And I think that's true for anyone that's been through any kind of tumultuous or hypergrowth environment.
Wow. Okay, so let's start with one, which, if I can summarize, is the team is the most important thing. Yet when we think about recruiting, almost everybody, myself included, we think about the individual, right? We're like, we're recruiting for this role. We want to get this type of person. So you guys realized at Bridgewater actually like, well, we can have the smartest people in the world in one room, but if there isn't like teamwork or chemistry or those things, like, then it's actually not working as well. So then how do you solve that problem? Like, how do you recruit for the team?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the point you made about like we're recruiting for this role is really critical. We ran into this problem of having, too many Fulbrights as executive assistants. And it turns out when you're trying to schedule a meeting, you don't want people debating the nature of time. You want people to just schedule the fucking meeting. And I think that's one of the challenges that comes with this notion of let me hire all of the excellence in all of the world. And it's one of the more common failure modes I've seen with founders and executives across the board is this idea that my role is more special than another versus really focusing in on what work the job requires done. And not all jobs will require a perfect SAT score and a Stanford degree. And I think one of the things that's hard to weigh and really only can come with time is this idea that the role is something that is not finite. If you need a person for a finite role, maybe it's now, maybe it's in 6 months, you can get an agent for that. But really what you're trying to hire is someone that can understand the context and shape the concept of what the role should be. And I think ultimately finding those folks that can, to borrow a phrase, be barrels and not just bullets is the better art of valor and talent.
The other thing for me about Bridgewater that's really interesting is this culture of experimentation. And maybe this is just like, I've read Principles from Ray Dalio and like, I've certainly drank the Kool-Aid from the book. But I think one of the underlying things that makes that place successful is we're just going to test out a ton of shit. And we don't care how crazy the test sounds. We're just going to run it to the best of our ability. We're going to see what happens. We're going to take those learnings, apply what works, and then get rid of the rest of this shit. That's what I saw from the outside. And examples from this I saw from the outside is like the dog collector. So for people who don't know, the dog collector is this radical fucking thing to where you're in a meeting. Everybody basically has like, think of it as like a scorecard on every person in the meeting. And you could score them as like after the meeting ends, like, oh, I'm giving Arthur an 8 for this podcast. And then at the end of the day, you have all this shit from every conversation or every meeting you've been in and like numbers and scores associated with that person. That is such a wild experiment. But it feels like Bridgewater is like the only place doing that. Like, do you think that is actually a helpful type of culture? Like, it seems to work for Bridgewater. And I guess my question is like, why aren't more companies innovating like that? Like, is it too much?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think ultimately the view I came out with is that your cultural strategy comes from your business strategy and not the other way around. Bridgewater's business strategy ultimately was about reducing the risk of human error and making better investment decisions over time. The only way you can get to being a better investor is to write down your bets and measure them month over month, year over year, decade over decade. And so a lot of that culture of experimentation and really systematic first principles based research came from that probably doesn't apply the same if you're just trying to ship a cereal to market or be, the quickest mover in a new space where you have to land and expand and prove your worth. The reality is experimentation is easier to do if you have, a national research budget or your margins are better than cocaine, and that's not true for most businesses. And so I think personally and spiritually, I'm long experimentation, but I think most people convince themselves when they have failures that they're experimenting, and they don't necessarily have the intellectual discipline to truly control the variables and truly try to get to what a meaningful conclusion could look like. And so I think the balance between the experimentation culture and why don't more companies do it is that folks like to subscribe to the same old ideas about what works, or to listen to their investors, or to try to just parrot the things that they're hearing on podcasts or on X. And ultimately, I think what the actionable takeaway from Bridgewater is really to hold yourself to intellectual task and be uniquely and ruthlessly honest in terms of the reasons you're doing things and why those things may or may not be right for your moment in time and your unique context.
Wow. Okay, so I think like my take on the amount of experimentation is like I'm addicted to those things because like I always feel like there's like continuous iteration, I think, is the way to build a great business. And it seems like Bridgewater did that in every aspect of the business, especially with people. I guess like a question and offshoot of that culture is like, could people handle it? Like, I noticed this like right now with like my family members who don't work in tech. Like the amount of change happening in the world right now with like AI and politics, they're just like like their brains are melting and they can't handle this. And I actually feel like most humans fall into that category. So like with all of the change that you guys had all the time, right? With these different people programs and like how we thought about shit, like, was there like a small subset who like these were the people who could actually handle this? Or like, did you guys have to bring people along consciously to ensure that like they felt safe in their work?
Yeah, I think this concept of safety is an interesting one because I think there's a certain toughness of the ego that comes from it being constantly under challenge. I think ultimately, I forget the Seneca quote, but some version of, like it's the battles that we fight in our minds that show up the most every day. And I think one of the things that Bridgewater was good about was taking those mental battles and models and making them explicit. We're in a unique place, I think, as a society, as a people, where so many mental models are being challenged and fought over that folks are largely either subscribing to a party line or subscribing to, their next favorite Twitter influencer and not doing their own underwriting. And I think what was unique about the folks that made it through Bridgewater is they were uniquely good at this concept of two U's and constantly updating, the idea of themselves as well as the idea of themselves operating within Bridgewater. There was a fairly high attrition rate. There was a very high failure rate of new hires. But ultimately, the folks that made it to the other side were the ones that were willing to question things that had made them successful and try to write a new playbook and a new script for how they might show up at Bridgewater. And I think that's actually the useful thing that Bridgewater and its alumni network has spawned, is this idea that particularly within our own careers, like we're not just our greatest hit, we're actually constantly trying to be in the kitchen, innovating, becoming better versions of ourselves. And I think that's ultimately, some of the stuff that's been popularized as like fixed versus growth mindsets, because the only safety that you really have is in being able to bet on yourselves. It's not Bridgewater that made those people great. It was their ability to make themselves great within Bridgewater. And I think that's something that's thankfully stayed with me and with a lot of the folks I've had the privilege of working with over time.
Yeah, I can tell. I mean, it seems like a common thread between you guys. Okay, last question on Bridgewater, and then we'll move on, which is like, you just said something kind of like offhand, which is the attrition rate of new hires was quite high. I'm assuming you guys tried to solve that problem and then got to the realization that it turns out hiring is an imperfect game. Interviewing is imperfect. and we just have to be comfortable with missing. And so what we're going to get really good at is fixing those misses. Is that an accurate statement?
Slight edit on that. I think we were more concerned about the false negatives than the false positives. And so I think our challenge was not to solve for the people that didn't work out at Bridgewater. It was to solve for the folks that went on to get a Theo Fellowship or to start unique venture that provided outsized return. There's a lot of those folks where over the years we might have disqualified them because they didn't show up skewed to whatever heuristic we were indexed on. And the thing that was unique about Bridgewater is like we would find that one exceptional person or persons and really try to study the case for where we went wrong for either not hiring them or not being able to unlock their potential at Bridgewater. And I think it's something that has personally stayed with me the most is that most of the time you're graded on how big your wins are, not on keeping losses to a minimum. And I think particularly within the sort of idea of talent and talent strategy as a portfolio, you see this in most organizations where the majority of outperformers are the ones that drive the organizational momentum and generate outside value. And we spend so much of our time trying to manage towards this messy middle. And I think the reality is like we're reconstructing organizations in real time, particularly with the advent of AI. And so it becomes less about headcount preservation and more sort of work optimization. And it sounds a little bit less couth to share that, but I think in a world where your outperformers have the power of AI, that statement will only become more and more true.
You keep saying these like profound things, kind of like in this amazing like context that you're providing. Another one of those things that you just said was we looked at the people who we didn't hire that went on to do amazing things, and then went back and did you say reviewed like what you guys missed about that?
Yeah, it's very much like the hiring anti-portfolio as an idea. And so understanding what we got wrong. I think of, some folks that we actually did hire that, were on the cusp and we somehow gold coined and pulled them over. And largely it was the people that didn't look like the people that we'd hired before. It's like the intern that didn't turn in a single research assignment for the entire 12-week internship, but then, produced a binder full of insights from hanging with, the folks at Goldman's desk, or, the kid with like a 2.0 at University of Michigan who had been running a trading book and not going to class. In both of those cases, we're thankful to have hired them, but ultimately in the cases of the person that went to go build a new crypto asset, it's our bad for not recognizing that sometimes like the lateral potential is harder to spot with the conventional indicators.
Wow. That is it's so fascinating to me, and something that I've never even considered is like, of course, that's something we should do. Is if we're talking to these amazing people and then they go like, because here's the thing is like you're talking to so many amazing people, but what you're talking about is like truly these N of ones that go on and do something unbelievable that you miss on. And so it's like, go learn from them. And then the other thing I think I'm taking away from the hiring approach is what did Henry used to say, CEO of Carrara, is like, instead of thinking about what could go wrong, think about what could go right. Right? It's like with these people, it's like having more of this like glass half full approach on what they could do. It's such an interesting reframe. I do think like what's unique about Bridgewater is you fix the mistakes and you fix them very quickly. And that's typically where companies do not follow through and do not do a good job.
Totally. It goes back to the intellectual honesty. I think it's one thing to look at the people that are still in seat years down the line. But it's the true measure is all of the impact that might have been captured, might have been within your organization that for fate or fortune isn't there.
Yep. Okay. I want to quickly talk about better.com. So for those that don't know, better.com was one of the fastest growing companies, I think, of all time. The valuation was like, it got to astronomical heights very, very quickly. Undoubtedly, I think was like one of the leaders in the space. And then a viral moment happened to where a layoff, basically it was a layoff that went wrong, went around the world. Everybody saw it. And then, I think that was like that really popped the hole into the balloon of the company. I still think it's around, I think it's doing okay, but like not as what it was once was. What were your learnings from Better?
Totally. I think we did a lot of things right. We did a lot of things wrong. I think the real answer is it's hard to be remembered for your worst moment and not your best. Ultimately, I think from day one, the team aspired to and at some point achieved like a uniquely high talent density. I think that's what made the balloon popping so painful. It wasn't just all the lives that were impacted and everyone that suddenly going into the holidays was unfortunately without a job, but it was the reality that years later when I'm catching up with folks, it's still like this sense that like, oh, those times were really good, we were really cooking, we were really doing something special. And I think the hard thing and what we got wrong ultimately was this idea of like getting high on our own supply. I think at some point when SoftBank came around and we thought we were on top of the world, we could hire anyone we wanted to do anything we wanted. That momentum unfortunately sort of pulled us off a cliff. And I think the challenge is losing that thread of intellectual honesty, where we were for a unique period of time really able to produce a lot more revenue per loan and all the leading metrics that you'd underwrite to say like, hey, they're really doing it. And I think when gravity came down, my strongest held, least productive belief is that water will find its level. It's really hard to predict when that'll happen or how quickly. But I think we don't have enough integrity and safeguards to prevent that from happening. And unfortunately, I think we were a little bit ahead on calling it and letting everyone go. But because of that speed, because of that urgency, we wound up bearing the brunt justifiably of the media and everyone picking this up and really kind of making a show of what happens when you mistake the plot for the destination.
The other thing I'll add on Better is like it feels like that company with what had happened, it was at like the perfect moment for like the viral short clips plus employee activism plus it had never happened before, right? And so you kind of get this like perfect storm of events to where that layoff gets recorded, it goes hyper viral fucking everywhere. And then I remember seeing it and being like, thank God that had not happened to me. And I think that's actually like a really important framework for people to think about. What you said is so true, which is like it often we remember things or people or companies for like their worst moment, and it just completely gloss over everything else that went well there. And I would tell people one of the things I'm learning in my life right now is to try and realize that like we're in this era of social media right now. It's where it's like really easy to just get a soundbite and then let your mind run away with a story on everything else that happened there. Like I had met Vishal, who's the CEO of Better. It was one of the most astonishing and thought-provoking conversations I've ever had in my fucking life. And so I think it's like, that's really helpful context for people. The other thing that you just said, which keeps coming up for me of like why I really like hanging out with you, is you keep saying intellectual honesty. Can you define that for people? And like, I would just define that for people for me.
Yeah, totally. I think at the end of the day, it's having consistency between, the ideas that you're espousing and, the behaviors that you're practicing. I think at some point, if you're out there, talking a book and, shilling whatever the ideas of the day are, and you're not actually updating and holding yourself to task about whether or not these things actually work themselves out in real life, that's where you can sometimes get led astray. I think it's easy to fall in love with your darlings and just carry on without, checking your details, going deep into, the way your day-to-day is being managed. The thing I'm most paranoid about as like a leader, as an operator, is that once you lose sight of focusing on the work, it's easy to come to believe that you're more successful than you are. And I think the cautionary tale of most of the ZERP era, not just Better, but sort of the entire curve of companies, is the market as a whole rewarded this ability to be loud in public and to pitch 3 times and execute once. And as multiples have come down and as the market has stopped rewarding excess, what you've seen is a lot of folks either having to acknowledge that their businesses aren't as great as they were, or that they need to to borrow the phrase, go back into founder mode to re-earn the right to perform at the level that they're expecting to.
Another thing you said, which actually transitions into Carrara, you have this thing of like focusing on the work. And that seems to be like a common thread of stuff that you've been saying to me over the course of the last couple of months. So let's get into Carrara. So you're helping early stage companies lay the foundation for exceptional talent and operations. You wrote a letter when announcing the company, and this is the paragraph that like really stood out to me. For the past 15 years, everyone lived under a comfortable illusion. Focus on people and the work will take care of itself. This was by and large true in an age where the excess returns on technological creation outweighed the carrying costs of bullshit jobs. What does that mean? Like, what do you mean when you say that? Like, I get can you explain that to me?
Yeah, totally. There's an article at some point in early COVID that I remember that came out that really built on this bullshit jobs concept. But I think it sort of made the case that like, hey, if you're a community manager for farmers in central Indonesia, you probably shouldn't be working in Chelsea trying to optimize single payer farmer monetization. And I think the reality is a lot of folks for many years got comfortable with this idea of like my job title, my rank in the organization, sort of where I ascend to in terms of the Peter principle is worthy enough of like recommendation and acclaim. But I think that the reality is, and you've seen this kind of with a lot of the big tech correction, most acutely Meta and others that have laid off a lot of workforce and productivity has gone up. It's just the reality. There is a whole lot of folks that were not producing. And I think that in the balance between capital and labor, the pendulum always kind of swings. But I think the hard thing is that a lot of these rituals of big titles, of performance management, of happy OKRs when everything are going right, is folks weren't digging to that next level below to understand who was actually on the keys and who was producing what. And I think particularly with a lot of what's coming out today, you're increasingly only as good as like the points that you put on the board. And it's a lot harder to subscribe to this idea that, because I work for the fanciest companies or because I've had the fanciest titles, that's enough. Sort of everyone has to kind of re-earn their stripes. And I think as that happens quicker and quicker, the only solution really is to focus on the work being done and making sure that it's done at the urgency and the quality that it needs to.
Totally. To use your word illusion, which I think is so good, I think we're coming out of this era right now to where it was easier to point to the company where you worked, your title, your tenure at that place, which actually doesn't mean anything. Like none of it means anything. Actually, the only thing that matters is what value did you create? What did you do? And so there's a lot of heat right now on, Elon said we're filming this on March 3rd. Elon sent the email of like, what 5 things did you do last week? And by the way, he did that like 2 years ago with the Twitter people. But it's actually not that crazy of a fucking concept, right? It's like, I've actually been thinking about this in my clients. It's like, I actually want to proactively send them an email every week to let them know what I did, because I think it helps maintain alignment. It's like, I have this concept of like showing your work. Like, I think it's actually like, you can't just do the work if nobody knows like you're fucking doing it, like you're operating in a silo and it doesn't matter. Like you have to be able to show it and then synthesize it and then socialize it, tell people about it. Kim Scott had this thing, who wrote Radical Candor. She used to send out snippets every week to her boss, like, 5 or 6 snippets on like, here's what I did, here's what I got done, here's what I'm doing next week. Is that what you mean by like focusing on the work?
Yeah, it's not a new idea by any stretch, but whether it's snippets or the things you've done, I think the push you're actually making towards proactivity is real. I think you're seeing this actually in Assist.U, obviously having run Continuum, is like in this market of like increased fractional work as organizations get unbundled. It's not quite that everyone's just going to move back towards a billable hour model and sort of time and material served. But you are going to get to this place where folks are questioning, like, are you better than the bots, or can I put this somewhere cheaper and outsource it, or can I get leverage versus paying you for goal ownership? And I think this idea of the hierarchy of work, there's a lot of work that is administration and execution, and I don't denigrate that. There's this high order of work that's a little bit more specialized, whether you're a lawyer or an accountant or otherwise. But I think increasingly in a lot of these, particularly early stage company jobs, what you're paid for is generating momentum for aligning direction and really amplifying and amping up the ability to execute on that direction. And I think it's harder and harder to just like sit in an organization and hide. There's a whole suite of tools out there that are, now measuring every click, not just in a sort of mouse jiggler kind of way, but actually looking at like, hey, what documents have you produced? Are your emails high substance? And I think one of the challenges as the bar for intelligence goes up with everything AI that's coming out is like you're increasingly going to have to be able to synthesize more and drive activity. And for the professionals that aren't able to do that, they're going to get hit with the what did you do this week, not just weekly, but daily. And the more that happens, the more trust is lost. It's one of the things that I appreciate about Vishal is, he always had this affection towards Liar's Poker and sort of the old school Solomon Brothers aesthetic. But it's not that you were ever necessarily fired or anyone came around your desk and gave you like a 5-point performance review. You just slowly lost pull because your trades weren't as good, because you weren't executing as quickly, and because you weren't with the plot. And by no means am I saying that's the right way to do talent management, but I think there is something very Spartan in this approach to work, where if you're really keyed in on how much substance are you generating and can I hear that, that's the real thing that I'm pushing my team and all of us working with founders to really try to interrogate, but avoid this idea of, just underwriting off of like brands and signifiers and the bullets that people put on a resume, but actually get to the root of what did people do and understand what problems they solved.
Yeah, it's also incredible like how few people actually do that. And so when you do something that is quite basic, how much it can help elevate you and help you stand out from the crowd. Just on the like things you got done, right? So I think a lot about productivity, and I think there is such thing as productivity masturbation, to where like it feels really good, but actually like you're not doing anything because you're in this constant state of the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, or like, can I make my tools better? Shane Parrish, who runs the Knowledge Project, wrote the book Clear Thinking. I'm a huge fan. And one of the things he talks about with knowledge workers, white collar workers specifically, is we don't normalize having thinking time. How do you think, how does like what you're talking about with these specific outputs, how does that like match up with like making sure we're spending enough time thinking and reflecting on things?
Yeah, it's a great push. And I think he has that line of like, there's always something you can do in the moment to better tomorrow. And I think that's actually, the intersection point is there's always a time series on productivity where, and I think good engineers, good product leaders, good technologists know this, where it's not actually about activity or the lines of code that are committed. It's about what are those interstitial moments where you can really synthesize the problem and reframe it. And realistically, that takes time. I think the reason it's easier to fall to activity is because most of the time when there aren't outcomes, it's easier to manage process than it is to manage progress. But when you look back at the history of technological revolutions, it's a lot more punctuated equilibrium. It's not that people are linearly plodding along and getting further up the curve. It's let's sprint for a while in this direction, realize the rocket doesn't work, and then hard pivot and run the other way. And this idea of swinging that pendulum from approach is where I think a lot of that clear thinking has to happen, is like being intellectually honest, really being rigorous on, is all this activity worth it? And even if we wasted a quarter, or we wasted a year, or we wasted, even more investor capital, if you continue to buy your bullshit, it doesn't mean you're going to get to the right answer. It's partially why I respect founders that can, hang up the spurs and say like, hey, we didn't do it. We didn't get to the right place. We're going to go pivot and truly, destroy the thing that we built to build something new. And I think we all do some version of that on a more regular basis. And so it's not just about responding to Slacks quicker or being distracted while you're on Zoom. It's doing kind of the thing that Jamie Dimon alluded to, which is like actually hashing it out with people and debating whether or not the activity that you're doing has any substance.
The other thing you didn't explicitly say, but that is making me think about, is sunk cost. Like, by saying like, oh, like it doesn't matter how much money we spend or how much time we spend on this thing. If it's not working, you need to be intellectually honest that it's not working and go a different direction. And I think the reason people don't do that, and speaking as somebody who has built his entire career in recruiting and talent, early in my career, I had the hardest time pivoting away from ideas because I was like, oh, my identity got attached to this thing. And my ego got attached to my idea. I told people this. Now I'm going to look like an idiot and go the other way. What I have learned as I've matured is that the smartest people, agnostic of role, I think the smartest people I hear speak, have no sunk cost. They don't give a shit how much money or time or energy they spent on a thing. They don't give a shit about like how many times they said it. The moment they realize they're wrong, they hard pivot and go a different direction. And that is something I think like many people in talent and HR can take and apply. Because as one of you, me, I was the worst at this. And the moment I decided to make that flip, it felt like my life changed and I was like super free to actually like operate in the real world and be intellectually honest with myself. Do you agree with that? Like, it feels like there's something with talent people to where they hold on to these things like a little bit longer than everybody else.
Yeah, I think, it's true in talent. It's true in real estate. It's true in any kind of like brokerage business, is like the first muscle is sales. And your easiest mark. We convinced ourselves, of the things that we're trying to convince others. And sometimes this is something I talk to a lot of our recruiters and a lot of our talent teams about, is that, this isn't a sales conversation. You're not trying to win the argument. We're trying to get to truth. And I think that ultimately happens, as you said, like internally first. For me, I used to have this idea of, love the underdogs, love the scrappy kids. I grew up in Queens. My family's from Poland. I always had this idea of like, I'm always going to bet on, the folks with a little bit less, and hopefully that's a little bit more upside. And I actually had to like really sort of untrain myself of this idea that, at the end of the day, you can get folks that are potentially starting from like a different plateau and a different level and still sort of track their trajectory and their slope over time, because it's not just a bias one way or the other, but it's really looking at like relative impact over time. And increasingly, I think, I still love YOLOing it and falling in love with candidates and taking bets. But at the end of the day, we are paid for the winners. And so I'd rather be more right than wrong over time. But the challenge is like, you're constantly trying to update your underwriting. You're constantly trying to get better at predicting. And it is hard to be consistently right if you're always putting in these, beliefs, one way or another.
Yeah. So at Carrara, what is your process for delivering the winners? Right? Because like I'm assuming it's not like, here's my playbook that I developed, like that I've once developed and that it works at every company. Like, what do you do?
Yeah, our sort of ideology is basically the opposite. I've become much more suspect of like playbooks as a sort of like a new kind of religion. We have a lot of playbooks. We have a lot of biases in terms of how to do things. But at the end of the day, we're focused not on just bringing the best supply to the yard, but really indexing more heavily on demand. What's successful at Bridgewater isn't what's successful at Better, isn't what's successful in babysitting. And if I'm like honest with myself, most of the time it's trying to get founders and leaders out of their own way to really understand what will truly be successful in their environment. And that requires a certain amount of back and forth and trust. There's always this balance between client service and client management. It's dangerous to take directions from tourists because if they knew where they were going, they wouldn't need to ask you for help. And so, it's this well-informed balance between arguing for, what we have seen to be true in more situations, and really trying to get to a bottoms-up view of what does demand in your organization look like. We see it a lot with founding engineers. We see it a lot with founding account executives, where you're really trying to match to the founder rather than to even the business problem or the industry, and trying to tease out those nuances and get founders to be self-aware, to be reflective, to be open-minded about their own biases. That doesn't mean those biases aren't real. It just means you have to selectively exercise them. And one of the things that I think builds trust with our clients, and it's something we hear time and again, is that at the end of the day, our job is to sort of hold that mirror up a little bit closer and show them sort of what the market is telling them. And if we are able to facilitate that process, not objectively, but with insight and with recommendation, and accelerate the time to that insight, that's ultimately where the value is coming from. And that's ultimately where we earn our keep.
Can you elaborate on how you guys show founders what the market's saying?
Totally. It sounds cheesy, but like we do the work. We talk to all the people. We get the notes. We're exploring partnerships like those with Metaview to help us collect the data. And a lot of this is just applying principles and evidence-based reasoning to something that oftentimes feels a little bit more fluffy. In the school of science versus art, we probably veer a little bit more towards science. But at the end of the day, it's hard to replicate taste and judgment. And that's where we aspire to excel, is that when we're sharing insights back based on the evidence, a lot of people could look at the same body of evidence and potentially come to different conclusions. And so that's where we put our thumb on the scale to try to drive what we think will work. That doesn't mean we always get it right, but when we talk about hiring bets, we talk about it almost like a procurement decision of, this is the market, this is what we learned, this is where we think price to value exists, and this is why we think this is the right trade. And ultimately, I think it's that substantiation and that focus with founders that I think builds trust, because it's less about selling them on what we think the right answer is. It's trying to show them the evidence and together engage in that process of either agreeing or disagreeing on where it should take us.
Is there you guys are, and this is a terrible way to frame it, but a vendor, right? You're a third party, right? You're not a full-time employee. If you were, would you deliver that to the founder differently?
Yeah, I think there's integrity and there's privilege in being on the other side. We try to stray as close to we're on your team, we're embedded as possible, agnostic of whether you're a small client or a big client or an annoying client or an exciting client. Fundamentally, I think this idea of what constitutes the organization is reshaping. And the reason that I think we can push as much as we do is because we have the benefit of not being beholden to a single portfolio or being beholden to a single client. At the end of the day, you don't necessarily care if your doctor's a Mets fan. It's nice if you guys can get along about your shared view of the world. But at the end of the day, you're paying for the expertise and the fact that theoretically, their opinions hold water. And that's ultimately, I think, where we aspire to. I think being internally, I think that's something that is always a harder trade, which is like, am I willing to put my salary and my livelihood on the line? To your point, I think there's a balance between being evangelical and being principled. If you're not willing to change your mind and you're always kind of trying to crusade for something, then it's less likely that you'll be taking seriously on each decision. But if you're showing folks your process, if you're showing folks your data, whether you're a vendor or whether you're internal, that's the way to earn trust over time, so that you can then exercise more of the judgment that you aspire to.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a friend about this weekend who was having a hard time influencing inside of his company. And what I told him was, all you can do is like the great process work, like what you're describing, right? Which is like, get the data, synthesize the data in the way that's as most objective as possible, and then present the data in a non-emotional way. And then here's the big thing: be comfortable with whatever the decision is. Because you may be right. You assume you're right. Like, everyone assumes they're right going into this thing. And it turns out my biggest learning from Carta was I was wrong like 60% of the time. Like, with my, Henry had this like crazy ability to do what I thought at the time was insane shit that ended up being totally right. And it made me re-underwrite like me and my own opinion. And instead, like, yes, I'm going to come to the table with options of things that we can do and my recommendation, but I'm not going to get so attached to my recommendation, because I am always leaving an increasingly higher probability that I am wrong. And I think this is the thing of when you are trying to navigate internally, don't get so tied to your own ideas. You agree?
Yeah, I think it's a hard balance. It's just if you're Henry, or if you're founder type, I'll be the first to tell you, it's like the things that got you to where you are unique and oftentimes legendary. But I think creating an environment, to title back to the beginning, like what Ray did. The balance of an idea meritocracy is not that, the intern with 6 weeks of experience is going to be right more than, X person that's been doing it. But it's an ideal environment when you can get that intern to test their ideas and make them better. Because on the off chance that they might be right, you never want to dismiss it. But I think it's creating a forum where you can actually talk about the merit of different ideas and force yourself to make ideas better. And I think that's it's a hard balance, whether you're internal, whether you're external, because ultimately we and I personally appreciate the clients that we learn stuff from more than the ones that are just happy going along with what we think the right answer is, because in the debate comes value, and whether that value's today or down the line with the next client. I think the opportunity ultimately is in finding folks that will challenge you. And so if you're an internal person struggling with being challenged, that's the first step I'd check, more so than or am I more likely to be right or more likely to be wrong.
Arthur, I've been podcasting now for like 2 years, and this is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Nolan. I appreciate it. This is great.